he got into some guy's face in the front row of the original room, and the guy was drunk and pulled him down into the crowd, and Richard got up and like swung the microphone stand at this guy. And
Okay, first Zoom interview since I moved to my new location in Kennewick, Washington. And one of the things I'm doing now is working at a place called Joker's Comedy Club, which does comedy every weekend in Richland, Washington, which is about 10 minutes from my house. And for the moment, I'm helping manage that room. So I get to see a lot of comics come through that I haven't seen in years. And Carl Wolfson came through the other week. And this is a guy that's done pretty much everything in the business. He was a headliner when I started in the late 80s, early 90s at the LA Cabaret. And it was great to see him again after all these years. And, well, check him out. Carl Wolfson. Some great stories and a lot of experience. Yeah, I didn't have the microphone plugged in. That's, I need a technician. I'm the talent. I need a technician.
That's right. You're above the line. You need below the line people.
I need to walk in, somebody do makeup, lights, sound, everything needs to be ready for me. I sit down and then we start the goddamn interview.
Yeah, those are the old days, Leif.
Now it's all do it yourself.
That's right. It's now a different economy.
Yeah.
Comics.
Let me tell you something. It's such. This was exciting for me. I've taken a 7-month break from doing these interviews, and you're the first one back. So I'm extra nervous, extra excited, and it's a really such a pleasure to talk to you because you were there when I started, and you were already headlining, and you were one of the guys that was nice to me when I was starting out.
Well, that's very sweet. Now, how can someone not be nice to you, Leif?
That's what my mom says.
Well, good to have a lot in common with your mom. That's a great place to start. Comedy, I started I got to LA at the end of 1979, and really my first spots of the Comedy Store were in early 1980. But looking back on it, it was all such great fun when you look back on it, and it really was an incredible time. But of course, at the time, in addition to being fun, Hollywood could be ruthless. There was a lot of people competing in a cutthroat way, and like any other profession, there was ups and downs. But looking back on it, and you and I are still active as comedians, but I've been thinking more about the 80s and 90s, especially the 80s, and what a unique time it was. As life goes on and you look back.
Right, and you were there, right? You were at the beginning of the boom, 79, 80. Yeah. Now, my history, timing is everything, and story of my life. I did comedy between 77 and 80.
Well, there you go.
And then I took a break until 88, and that's when I met you in the late 80s. So you were.
I hope you didn't take a break because you met me.
But yeah, right. For those that don't know, the disco ruled the 70s. Disco was huge in the 70s, and then in the late 70s. Early 80s is a comedy took over from disco, and there were just anywhere you put up a comedy sign, there would be lines around the block.
That's right. And I track it also, Leif, with Saturday Night Live, which I think it started 74, 75 or so. Saturday Night Live really added to that comedy boom.
Oh, okay.
And comedy, like a lot, was centered in New York. The Improv was in New York, and everything kind of moved out to Los Angeles. I believe Mitzi started the Comedy Store, and Sammy Shore had a little room in what was the old Ciro's in 8433 Sunset Boulevard.
Right. Now for those that may not be in tune with this, could you tell us what the Comedy Store was, and who Mitzi was, and who Sammy was?
That's right. LA originally, when we're talking about the 70s, mid 70s on up into the 80s, was defined basically by the Comedy Store, which is 8433 Sunset Boulevard, and the Improv, which is on Melrose. Bud and Silver, his wife, Friedman, had the Improv in New York. I believe they divorced, and Bud came to LA and started the Improv, which was the challenge to the Comedy Store. Those were the two big locations, other than the Ice House in Pasadena, which had been kind of a theater comedy place for many people and acts beyond comedy. Smothers Brothers used to play there, but a lot of musical acts played at the Ice House. You remember the House in
Right.
Pasadena.
So now you just brought up an interesting irony there. You said Bud and Silver Friedman divorced, and Bud got the Improv, and then just jump ahead a little bit. Sammy and Mitzi Shore divorced, and Mitzi, the wife, got the Comedy Store.
That's right. That's exactly right. Sammy Shore, Mitzi's husband, was a comedian himself and basically a warm-up act for big names or singers or whatever in Vegas and Reno. And he started a little Comedy Store at 8433 Sunset. Now, that is a big building. And part of it it's called the Original Room, because that's what Sammy got, a little original room. In the divorce with Mitzi, and I think that's mid 70s, Mitzi got the Comedy Store, and Sammy didn't get anything, but the Comedy Store was a gold mine, because as you said earlier, comedy just took off in the late 70s. And Mitzi bought the rest of the building out. So we had the Original Room, which is I think 180 people fit in there. The main room sat 250 people. And then there was a little room upstairs called the Belly Room, which sat about 60 or 70 people. And I remember when I hit the Comedy Store in 1980, one of the first people to do a one-woman show in the Belly Room was Whoopi Goldberg, because people were coming out from New York to perform at the Comedy Store. So Sammy continued to do comedy, and he had a little, occasionally over the years, he would have little venues in LA, but Mitzi got the gold mine.
Right.
And you said in the 80s, lines around the block. All you had to do was open the door. When I first started the Comedy Store, every night it was Robin Williams, Richard Pryor, occasionally Rodney Dangerfield, Steve Martin. My first paid spot in the Original Room of the Comedy Store in April of 1980. I was waiting to go on. Steve Martin comes in and goes on. Mitzi put him right on and did 25 minutes. And then I struggled to get a laugh following him. Because, you know, even my sister and her boyfriend went to get Steve Martin's autograph. They were in the and Mitzi, in her famous nasal line, said, "Carl, it'll make you stronger." You know, but that's what you saw in the early 80s in Hollywood. These new, you know, all of us were new. A lot of people were established, but you were thrown in with the big names of the day, and it was amazing.
It wasn't me. It was like I said, my first time on stage was in '77, before I took my break, and it was at the Comedy Store,
right?
And I bombed horribly. I got thrown in the mix of all those people that you mentioned,
right? Yeah.
On a Monday night. It was packed on a Monday night. I mean, it was complete. And I went on at 9 p.m. prime time, and that first time on stage.
Right.
And I just bombed miserably. I mean, just, you know, I found out what flop sweat meant. I literally just stood there sweating.
We all did. I had a little gimmick.
Well, wait a minute. You said that's very humble of you to say that. You know how many comedians are, I killed the first. I've always killed. Yeah.
always killed. Monday nights were traditionally, I don't know when you started, were audition nights at the Comedy Store.
Yeah, that was Monday night. Yeah.
In fact, Mitzi, it was tough for her to pay attention, because Mitzi was the owner of the Comedy Store, was a very hands-on person who liked to control every aspect of the business. So she could be back in the kitchen, but you know, if you were showcasing, you get 3 minutes in the Original Room, you wanted to see sitting there. Right. Now, I remember in '84, Roseanne came out from Denver, and Louis Anderson had come out in 1980. And Louis and I had worked with Roseanne and her husband, Bill Pentland, at Denver in the Comedy Works, and we knew Roseanne was very talented. So in '84, when Roseanne came out to audition for Mitzi on a Monday night, Louis and I sat on either side. We anchored Mitzi right there, saying, "Mitzi, pay attention. Roseanne's really good."
Right.
You know, I'm sure Roseanne would have made it anyway, but we got Mitzi to watch her, like her, and you know, I think you and I were discussing this when we performed in Richland. Of the comics of our generation, Roseanne Barr and Louis Anderson had really the most incredible debuts on The Tonight Show because, back in the day in the late 50s, if you had a great set on Carson, it made your career. Joan Rivers, whomever. With our generation, Gary Shandling was on, but it took him, Jay Leno was on, but it took him many sets to be known. But, Louis Anderson in 84 and Roseanne in 85 had such great debuts on the Carson show. You knew they would be superstars. But you had to get that stage first. You had to be on either at Bud's Improv or Mitzi's Comedy Store to get the talent scouts out to see. They owned the
right. I mean, these days, throughout the 80s, comedy clubs opened up all over the country. They popped up like mushrooms after a rain.
Absolutely.
And and people that weren't around in the 70s and 80s might not realize that back in those days there was New York, there was one or two clubs in New York, and then there was two clubs in LA, pretty much.
There was Second City in Chicago. There might have been in San Francisco, but that was it. Now, I want to do an interesting sidelight here, which I'm sure you know about. About 2 years before you were there in LA, but in 1978 there was a strike because Bud Friedman and Mitzi did not pay anything for comics to appear on their stages. Their theory was this is an opportunity for comics to get seen by those talent scouts
and to keep overhead down.
Right, of course. So in 1978, this is back when I was still in Tennessee at the time, but I read about it in the papers. The comics formed a union called CFC, Comedians for Compensation, and Bud agreed to pay $5 for a set at the Improv. Mitzi held out. She's not going to pay them. So they struck the Comedy Store. And the comics would use the Improv as their union hall. They set up a picket line around the Comedy Store, and customers coming in, they would say, "We'll take you in our cars down to the Improv. Don't come to the Comedy Store." So it became a bitter strike, and for years afterward, the comics were in two groups. Those who were loyal to Mitzi, including like Jimmy Walker and Argus Hamilton, and those who were strike leaders who Mitzi didn't want at her club anymore. So even after Mitzi agreed to pay the comics, really she didn't want to book the comics who had led the strike against her. So basically you were in the Improv camp on Melrose, you were in the Comedy Store camp on Sunset. Mitzi's only change to that was if you were so big, like Leno was a strike leader, but he became so big that she had to have him play the Comedy Store. And there was a death of a comedian named Steve Lebetkin in 1978. He after the strike was settled, Mitzi wouldn't give him spots, and he jumped off the Hyatt Regency building next to the Comedy Store and committed suicide. And his parents and a lot of people blamed Mitzi. It became very vitriolic. And let me just say, I was glad I wasn't there for that. I got there after the strike. But the last thing I'll say about that, the irony was, Bud never paid very much at the Improv. You could get, even into the 90s, you could get $25 for a weekend spot at the Improv or 15 during the week. Mitzi paid much more because in the main room, if you got a main room slot, which was the best of the Comedy Store, on Friday and Saturday nights, she split the gate with half the comics.
Oh, nice.
I got it a lot because I had this slideshow, this news update slideshow I did. You would easily make $1,000, 400 Friday, 600 Saturday in the main room. So, $1,000 in town back then in the 80s was good money. Plus you're on at the Comedy Store main room. Bud never paid that. So Mitzi ended up being a much better benefactor money-wise to comics than Bud ever did.
See, I was there, but I was not a part of that because I bombed so bad. I didn't even want to go back to the Comedy Store for years and years. I went to smaller venues. I went to a place called a vegetarian restaurant on Fountain that would have like between 5 and 12 people in the audience.
And plus they're vegetarians, they didn't have the energy to applaud.
Yeah. It was pretty hit and miss there. But and so anyway, I went to a place called the Rose Cabaret on Melrose, and
that?
I was very shy and very insecure, and it took me a long time to get comfortable on stage. Eventually, I went to a place called Osco's. I don't know if you ever heard of Osco's on Third and La Cienega.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of a neutral place. People from the Improv and the store would come there, and plus we'd have our regulars there. Robert Schimmel was one of the guys that started there, and Paul Rodriguez, and yeah.
Robert Schimmel he and Bob Shaw were the two funniest dirty comics.
Right.
And they really did X-rated, well, what we would call X-rated then material.
Before it was cool.
It was cool, but they were so funny. Schimmel and Bob Shaw were just amazing.
Yeah.
For me, a thing that happened in '82 was, as the Comedy Store and the Improv and other clubs around the country became popular, TV shows started happening. Evening at the Improv happened in 1982. And all the comics in LA were rushing to do an evening at Improv because the coin of the realm was to get on TV. Because if you were on TV as a regular comedian, then you became a headliner in the clubs. You command more money no matter where you go. So I did the evening at the Improv. Mitzi couldn't stop it because everyone was doing the evening at the Improv. So I got to play, and then Bud liked me, so I got to play the Improv and the Comedy Store. I was kind of one of the few that got to play both.
And then the boom happened, and then there was a lot of road work and
tons. I mean, every town had, and I'm talking town, not even city, would have 3 or 4 comedy clubs.
Right. I remember Phoenix had 5 or 6 when I started. Phoenix had 5 or 6 clubs.
Right.
Just Phoenix.
Yeah.
And
yeah. The story was you had a brick wall and a microphone. You had a microphone and a stage and a brick wall behind you. You had a comedy club. Now, a lot of those comedy clubs were fantastic. And in the 90s, when the recession hit in the early 90s, and TV had a lot to do with this because comedy was all over TV. When the recession hit and the economy took a slump in the 90s, a lot of people didn't have the money to go out and pay a huge cover charge and a 2-drink minimum, so they stayed home. What happened was the inferior clubs, the clubs in those cities that weren't well run, collapsed like dominoes. So a city that had 5 comedy clubs ended up with 2, or a city that had 6 ended up with 1. But those were the well-run clubs.
Those are the ones where they were willing to work.
Yes.
So many of them were just party rooms that they opened up because it was a boom, and all you had to do was put comedy in front by the front door, and it would fill up. And then suddenly you had to start working.
That's right. You had to run a business.
You had to run a business.
The product, 6 days a week or 5 days a week. There were also some clubs, I remember the 80s, that would try to pay you in cocaine. That was another thing.
Yeah, I miss, it's probably, I'm probably alive because I took that 8-year break. Because I missed that whole era. I got paid in cash when I started.
Well, I always got paid in cash too, but I'll tell you, there were club owners who would either want to pay you in cocaine, or they would know a supplier and then dock your fee for every 8-ball that you bought during the week. So by for a $2,000 week, you'd get a check for $140 at the end of the week,
and a bloody nose.
Your cocaine tab. But even into the early 90s, if you were a well-run club, and this is another thing people don't understand when you went out on the road, how much we worked. The Funny Firm in Chicago, let's say, I played them in like 88, 89, 90, early 90s. Comedy was so popular, Leif, that they did 2 shows on Tuesday, 2 on Wednesday, 3 on Thursday, 3 on Friday, 3 on Saturday, and 2 on Sunday. And lines were around the block.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you really worked, and very well when you played the clubs, 3rd show
night
can be because people are pre-drink, it's too late. It can be an awful audience to play for.
Not only that, but as a comedian, you're standing up there going, "Did I just do this bit?"
Yeah.
And sometimes you'd start a bit again, and people go, "You just did that."
I know, but that's the way. It's absolutely the way it was. And another thing that happened was because these clubs in the 80s and 90s existed, you'd have places like Victorville, California, Apple Valley, California, Corona, California, that where you have a bar and they do comedy on Saturday nights, or they
when I started, I mean, I did a lot of one-nighters because I got bumped up to headliner real quick in the one-nighters. So I was able to make a living,
right,
as opposed to being an opener in the bigger clubs,
right.
And David Tribble had, I don't know if he had 13 or 16 weeks, and I'm talking 5 nights a week of one-nighters.
Who just retired, and he's over across the river from us in Portland in Washington State, right?
Yeah. David's been around for a long time, and I think he had 16 weeks of one-nighters. And I remember Huck Flynn. I don't know if you remember Huck Flynn. He said he passed away as a guitar comic. I got a funny story about him, actually.
Tom Tyre is still alive.
Is he still alive? Did I just say he's dead and he's still alive?
I said Tom Tyre.
Tom. Yeah. But Huck Flynn.
Yeah.
I worked with him. He was one of the first people I worked with on the road.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me one phone call, because there were so many rooms and Tribble had 16 weeks. One phone call to Tribble would get him 32 weeks of work, because he'd work the same room 2 times a year. 32 weeks of work in one phone call. Now, to me, that
was that you weren't playing, and when I did those gigs too, a lot of the gigs too, you were playing places where people come in to drink, and comedy is an afterthought, because it's a comedy night. It's a bar 7 nights. A one-nighter.
Right. Yeah.
Where and the audiences tend to be, now if you were a great comic and it was a good night, you could grab any audience and hold them. But all things being equal, you'd want to go to a place where people came to see comedy.
Absolutely.
Half Stop or the Comedy Store, rather than to go drink and pick up, chicks or whatever.
Right.
And the worst were like, no matter where you were, if there was a wedding party or a bachelorette party, because they got the sex toys, they're talking among themselves, and oh my God, you might as well just give it up at that point, trying to compete with that in the audience.
So can I tell my Huck Flynn story?
Yes.
You cut me off, man.
I gave you the light.
You gave me the light. So Huck, I loved working with him, man. He was a party guy. Guitar act, and it was one of my very first road gigs in Fresno, and this was a weekend room, and they put us up at the Hilton, and this is back in the days when I don't know how many people remember this, but it used to cost a lot of money to make long distance phone calls from a hotel room.
Yeah,
and apparently after the show, so the 2 shows Saturday. It's like 2 a.m. All of a sudden, there's a knock at my door, and it's Huck. And he says they locked me out of my room. I ran up a $500 phone bill.
Oh no!
Over the weekend, and they locked me out of my room until I pay it. You've got 2 beds. Can I stay here with you? And I'm the opener. Right? He's a headliner. Right. And I said, yeah, sure. So he comes in. He goes, yeah, I bet you're going to tell everybody that the headliner had to come and sleep in your room. I said, no, I won't do that. 30 years later, I'm still telling that story.
There were a lot of comics, Leif, who were not good with money, and also at the same time did a lot of blow in the 80s.
Right.
There was one comic named John Fox. Now, there was a John and Ann Fox who booked rooms out of San Francisco. I'm not talking about them, but
right.
John Fox.
John Fox, the booker is still around, and John Fox, the comedian, is not. Yeah,
the booker used to do everything San
Francisco
north up to
big time, and the competitions, the San Francisco and the Seattle.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. But John Fox, the comedian, he's a funny guy, but he was always in debt. And the story about John was he would call up clubs that he was scheduled to play in 3 months and try to get advances. But you know, my favorite story about the demise of comedy, we're talking about where clubs would close and you'd be left in a town with just a bar that did
Right.
comedy. As you know, the Laugh Stop in Newport Beach was one of the best clubs ever. In fact, they started.
I thought you had some more great John Fox stories, because I mean,
John
I've
Fox
heard...
passed away, so I'm gonna.
Okay, all right. With all due respect,
John Fox story. But the Laugh Stop in Newport Beach was. I always said that the Ice House in Pasadena, the La Jolla Comedy Store, and the Laugh Stop in Newport Beach were such great audiences. If you didn't kill in those clubs, you might as well get out of the business. But in 1995, the Laugh Stop was sold, and it was really sad because that had been as I said, a magic place for comedians since the late 70s. And the new owner kept comedy one night on Saturday night, but made what was the Laugh Stop in Newport Beach a strip club. So 6 nights a week, it was strippers. And then on Saturday, it was comedians.
okay.
So I'll never forget the last time I played it. I drove down Bristol. The marquee comes into view and it says, "Girls, girls, girls." And I said, I know comedy's over, right? And you had to perform on the stage with like a pole and a mirrors behind you. I mean, it was like, can you even imagine?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's like?
Yeah, I can. I have a similar story. I got booked in LA. Paul Messier.
Oh, Paul Messier, yeah.
Booked me in a room in LA and told me the story that it wasn't really going to be it wasn't really going to be a comedy club, but they were promoting it as a comedy club to get the liquor license. They still had the liquor license pending, so they had the notices on the door and on the window and everything else. But it was really a strip club. It was going to be a strip club. So I show up there, and the stage, the pole, and a shower drain in the middle of the stage. And this is and then there's like 12 of the owner's friends. That's the audience.
Yeah, that's the audience.
And there's a guy in like $1,000 big guy. I mean, it's LA, but it was like New York in the, maybe in the 50s when the mob ran the rooms. Big guy with a $1,000 suit. Showed me the stage, and then he said, "Now you see that wall behind the stage?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Now you might hear some screaming from behind that wall when you're on stage. That's the owner. Just ignore it."
The mob. I know I played one. I'm not even going to say the club, but it's a major club on the East Coast that was reputedly mob run, and I had a great week there in '87. And I went in to get my pay. And I mean, it was just central casting. There was this big guy, cigar. I said, "I had a great week." Didn't even talk to me. Just threw a bag of cash at me. He said, "Count it," because you would. And this was a major city at a major club, and I believe it was mob run. But it just adds to the color of the stories we tell ourselves many years later.
Yeah. Did you count it?
I did count it.
Yeah, in front of him.
Right in front of him.
Yeah,
right.
That's balls.
It is.
But no, it's all right, man. It's okay. I'm sure it's fine.
In 1987, I was a headliner. I had balls.
Yeah.
Another story that was.
Well, you're still a headliner.
The club. This was in the late 90s. First of all, there's so many comics in Los Angeles. It's like actors in Los Angeles, singers in Los Angeles, dancers, all the artists, and relatively few slots for any of those groups, for aspiring actors, singers, musicians, comics. Actually, as comics, Leif, we had more opportunity. Think of the tens of thousands of would-be actors and musicians, the frustration.
Right. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you and I, who, got decent money as comics, and we maybe never became household names like Jay Leno or Robin Williams, but we could still make an incredible living because of these comedy stages we're talking about. You're a frustrated actor
Right.
You're a waiter, you're
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, you're a musician. You're splitting it 5 ways.
Exactly right. So in the late 90s, with so many comics in LA, no matter where there was a stage, they would run to it. And I remember there was a Marie Callender's, and those of you outside of LA, that's a,
Valencia.
Yeah, in Valencia. Absolutely.
Yeah, I've done it.
And they would offer you, they'd have there was a side room, I guess, where they had, dinner parties or groups, that they had a decent stage there. And on Friday and Saturday nights, or maybe just Saturday night, you would go up there and the headliner would get $100 and a pie. Marie Callender's was a pie.
I've done it.
Did you get the pie? So it's like, my line was, how does an agent negotiate that for you? Like, wants $105 and a cream pie.
Yeah, what's the pie?
Yes. Is it a berry? Is it a mixed berry? I want a pure berry pie.
Yeah. And I don't want the special.
Yeah. And there are a lot of comedians who demanded that pie beforehand and ate it before they went on stage. I mean,
that's funny.
Yeah.
Valencia, by the way, is my daughter's middle name. So just thought I'd throw that in there.
Yeah. Oh, nice. Did you name her after your experience there?
It was such a good pie. I named my daughter. No.
First name Blueberry?
Actually, her mother actually named her after her best friend who's passed away. So
very beautiful name.
Yeah.
I like it a lot. And then, of course, when you traveled around the country, there were different regions where you would play. I always say I was in Pamplona, Alabama, for the Running of the Rednecks, and I was bored by their sharp intellect. And Leif, I did current events material, and I'm kind of a liberal chap. So, when you did anti, George Herbert Walker Bush material or anti-Reagan material in conservative places, I remember even George Bush, I was doing a show in Texas, and I had whoever's president, you're going to do a good chunk of your material, political comic. So some big guy ran up to me after this show and he said, "You should listen to President Bush like he listens to the country." So I did. I tapped his phone without a court order. I got a lot of material about it, and really I was good natured about my comedy. But there were certain areas of the country where you had to watch yourself a little bit, because
and I think it's probably worse now.
I think it is worse now.
To be honest with you, the worst I had, and I didn't do a lot of political, like you. No, you do a little political comedy. I probably do. I do less. Mm-hmm. But I started out doing political comedy. So I worked in Shreveport, Louisiana at the Funny Bone, and it didn't. Well, I'll tell you 2 things about that. It didn't really get bad. It was packed every night. One night, I did one joke about George Bush, who was president at the time. And I was told later that one guy had stormed out, demanded to talk to the manager, and demanded that I be fired because I did a joke about George Bush.
Of course, absolutely.
So that's as bad as it got. The other one was I talked about evolution.
No.
And I said, swear to God, this is a packed room. And I said, so how many people here believe in evolution? One guy in the front row goes like this.
Emo Phillips has a great line. Emo.
I don't know him, but I know who he is. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I just did a festival in Woodstock, Illinois in 2018 and 2019, right before the pandemic. And I was on with Emo. He came in to do the festival, and I hadn't seen him in years, because it's another thing. If you're a headliner in a club, you're out headlining. You're not going to see other headliners. You're not going to run into them because you're playing the road, and unless you're back in LA and they're off the.
Which is, let me just insert that. Which is why it was such a great pleasure to see you after all these years. Because once I started headlining, I never saw you again until you came to the club where I work here in Richland, Jokers, and you headlined, and I'm helping.
That's right.
I was there, helping manage the room.
It's great to see people like Leif Skype, because we can talk about we'll talk about the LA Cabaret in a minute, because we have
right. That's where we hung out in LA. But I'm sorry, I interrupted. But yeah, a lot of people don't realize that that it's a very tight knit community, but it may be years between seeing people that you really like to hang out with, because if you're both headliners, you don't play on the same bill.
Right. And I forget my story, but
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm going to be 69 next month, so there's a lot of stories I'm forgetting. But
Congrats. I turned 67 yesterday, so I forgot what I was talking about.
I do remember when we were talking about the South that we're talking about emo.
Yeah.
Emo has a line, like I said, I hadn't seen, it was 2018 or 2019 in Woodstock, Illinois at the festival, and I hadn't seen emo in years. So I just sat back and really enjoyed his set. But one of his lines was, in that emo delivery, he goes, Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin, born on the same day and the same year. Lincoln and Darwin, the two mortal enemies of the South. And of course it was true. They were born in the same day and the same year. But that observation, the two mortal enemies of the South, goes directly to your, what you were talking about.
Right.
There's a comic I remember, and I just forget who it was, who talked about playing in Louisiana. And I don't know if it's Shreveport or not, but he did political material, and his line on stage was, "It was so quiet in the room, I could hear a bead of sweat roll down the crack of my ass."
Right.
I forget who that was at the moment, but that's you can be in those positions pretty quickly.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Comic, you get out of it pretty quickly, but
I think knock on wood, because you're always going to offend somebody. No matter what you do, you're always going to offend somebody. I think the fact that I'm 6'2" has saved me, because I've had a lot of comics that are a lot shorter tell me horror stories about being confronted physically and things like that. Yeah. I remember one time in Oklahoma City, there a big beefy cowboy, sitting there talking on his cell phone like he was home, loud during my set.
In the room, yeah.
Yeah, and I totally nailed him, and I got the audience on my side, and he was not happy at all. And I remember I was selling T-shirts, doing my merch after the show, and I remember out of the corner of my eye, I could see him just standing there, like glaring at me, sizing me up, like should I, shouldn't I? And right. I think the fact that I'm 6'2", I think he finally just decided to leave. Yeah.
I'm actually surprised, Leif, at all the crowds in the 80s and 90s in those clubs, that there weren't more incidents.
True.
Right. We talk now, maybe just the pandemic, but people getting upset on planes. I'm surprised. I do remember one time at the Comedy Store. Now, the first 13 months of the Comedy Store, I got spots, but I also worked door, because if Mitzi liked you, she would make you work. She would ask you to work door, which means you sat people, in the original room, main room, or whatever. In fact, Sam Kennison worked door when he was first out there. But I remember Richard in 1980, I was working the door in the original room. Richard Belzer was on stage. And for those of you who don't remember Richard, he's he went on to do a lot of acting bits, but he was a very New York, in your face comedy.
He was one of my early favorites before I even did comedy.
Richard was very funny, but he got into some guy's face in the front row of the original room. And the guy was drunk and pulled him down into the crowd. And Richard got up and like swung the microphone stand at this guy and missed his head by that much. But people started, fleeing. And Mitzi comes up. She goes, "Why is everyone running out?"
She wasn't in the room at the time.
Front, and she saw people running out of the store. So
I see.
Well, there's a brawl, and she goes, "Do something." So I had to Richard, to his credit, got back up on stage and did a comedic pivot about that.
Right.
But, had he hit the guy with the mic, with the mic stand,
right.
A tough injury there. And I'm always amazed that in that milieu of lots of people crowded in, with, as you said, the opportunity for a lot of people to be offended sometimes, that there weren't more incidents.
Right. Yeah. There's a famous one, and you know, yeah, there's a famous one video. I don't know if you can still find it on YouTube of a comic with a guitar just kabonging a guy and just breaking the guitar over his head, an acoustic guitar.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a famous one where Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones uses an electric guitar, literally like an axe, and just smashes some guy's head.
Oh my God.
Some guy that came running up on stage. It's like,
well,
yeah.
you know, usually, you know, it's, again, that's the job of the comedy store personnel themselves, or whoever's at the comedy club, for the manager. If someone's disrupting the show, you give them one person, and if they continue to disrupt the show, they're asked to leave. So, and that was one of the problems with the bar scene, where just to be Saturday night at a bar,
right?
Where owners or managers, they wanted the people drinking. They weren't going to throw them out if they were in.
Right.
There's more opportunity. You know, I ended up playing clubs that I enjoyed playing, you know, and cities I enjoyed. I love to go to Chicago and Minneapolis and Cincinnati. You know, there's certain clubs in areas where, and once you play there annually, you know, people come back to see you.
Right.
First time I played in Milwaukee in '86 at the Funny Bone, the feature comic and I were watching the people come in, and it was like, is this free pie night? These were, you know, huge people, and they had like t-shirts or jackets with like beer logos or bowling alleys, and I thought, wow, this is really a big crowd. They were the best laughers I may have ever had in comedy. This was a blue collar crowd in Milwaukee, but they loved to laugh.
Yeah.
That is the constant that I found in all of my now 8,000 shows, whether you're playing an Elks Club or a rock concert, people love to laugh.
Yeah. And you can never judge a crowd. I used to do it as a new comic, and I see new comics doing it all the time. Right. It's like, what's this crowd like? What do they like? And it's like, you don't, until you get on stage, you have no idea. You can't, no matter how they're dressed, you know.
Everyone wants to laugh. Everyone deserves to laugh.
Yeah.
And, you know, a crowd can be tight. A crowd can be loose. I found, you know, I told you in Richland, my theory is I have one rule: just have fun on stage. Because if you have fun, the audience has fun.
Right.
If you're nervous, the audience is going to be nervous for you. If you're belligerent, you're going to expect to get that back from the crowd.
Right.
You know, just have fun, and that's a good rule to have. But yes, never judge, you know, older crowds, younger crowds, whatever. Laughter is a currency that's universal, in my opinion.
Yes, yep. And it's an involuntary reflex. So, you know.
That's right. Babies are born with two emotions, laughter and tears. They cry, they laugh. And people need it so much. And, you know, we've been talking about this now for 35, 40 minutes, but what we did and do, Leif, is it's kind of an important thing. I mean, you know, being able to get people to not only laugh at the world, but laugh at themselves, and have an hour a night, or how much, you know, however time. Yeah. And it's gratifying when people leave the room and say, you know, this was so much fun, or thank you. You know, I really had a great time. And that's a reward that's beyond money.
It is, and it's worth reminding oneself of that, because I think maybe, you know, I'll speak for myself, but, you know, I think a lot of comedians are insecure, and we need the approval of others, and we're our own worst critics when it comes to our act. So it's good to be reminded of the fact that, we are it is good to laugh. And I'll tell you, the most rewarding rewarding times in comedy for me haven't been when I've, you know, like maybe, you know, killed for an hour, you know. I mean, those have been great times. Those have been great shows. And the times where you've been able to turn a room that started out very stiff. Exactly. The most rewarding has been the few occasions when somebody's come up and just sincerely looked you in the eye and said, you know, I've had a really terrible week or terrible day, and they've almost got tears in their eyes, and they said, thank you for making me laugh.
Absolutely. The late Louis Anderson, and I always loved Louis as a comic. He was one of the best. And I recognized this early when in 1980, we were playing La Jolla at the Comedy Store. And I would listen to the people who would come out after seeing Louis, and they would say, his dad was my dad, but my mother did the same thing his mother did, because there are universal things and universal truths that we impart about people's lives. And that connection, which can make you laugh and it can also make you cry, that's what we need more of in the world, just talking beyond comedy, because we're disconnected because of isolation and social media. What's so easy to
look what we're doing now. I mean, we're isolated while we're talking.
Now, I will tell you, there's a caveat to what I said about crowds. There is one group that I regret that I wouldn't play again. My friend Martha Jane, who, I don't know if you knew Martha Jane, but
I remember her.
She moved to Hawaii at some point, so she'd feature for me when I go over to Hawaii. But Martha was funny. We hung out together. When she was living in LA, she called me up. She says, "I got a gig for us." And I said, "Okay." She goes, "It's a nudist colony." And and my first one, I said, "Well, we can wear our clothes." She goes, "Oh, of course, silly. We can wear our clothes." But, it was out near Corona, California, and it was the most bizarre thing, because you're number one, the people who should never take their clothes off are the people who take their clothes off. Okay. So she went up and then I went up, and I was trying so hard not to look down at these people that my neck was stiff by the end of the show. Now, they laughed and enjoyed the show, but it was the most odd experience on stage playing for people in the nude. I have to tell you, maybe if I did it more often, I'd be more careful about it, but, relax with it. But it was bizarre.
It's funny you should say that, because I have done a nudist resort.
Really?
But they were dressed for the show.
Well, they were dressed for the show. Okay.
Yeah. But I took my clothes off on stage.
just to make them feel at home,
I do a character. Yeah. I have a DVD. I spent the whole week there, and we did like a, I don't know if you know my character, Kurt Sudden. He's my alter ego. And so we did a thing. It was a whole scripted out thing where Kurt Sudden is chasing Leif, skiving around, and Leif decides that the only place he's not going to show up is at a nudist resort. So it's a whole DVD. And then at the end, there's the performance. And then Kurt comes and takes over the performance, and he's nude and the audience isn't.
Oh, that's funny. The closer. Go ahead.
Yeah. And then I've got my from my genitals down to my knees blurred out.
Right.
So the joke is it's blurred out all the way down to my knees.
Do you remember Lenny Schultz? Crazy Lenny Schultz?
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know Lenny, and again, it's a comic who passed on many years ago. He was crazy. He was a nutty guy, and he literally had these large plastic garbage tubs. He literally would have 5-6 of them filled with props that he would set up on stage before he'd perform. And he'd use props for 40 minutes, all these different props. And he had little pigs, and he would make the audience, "More pigs, Lenny." And he'd put, "You want a pig? Here's a pig." And he put another pig down. At the end of his act, he would have his Lenny Schultz diet. And the diet was, wherever you wanted to lose weight, you smash the food on. And he literally would have cream pies and fruit and all that. And he would strip down to his underpants. He goes, "You want to lose weight in your stomach?" And he got a cream pie and he smeared it on his stomach. And, he would literally be there at the end of the show wearing his skivvies and all this food everywhere. I guess the only similar thing would be Gallagher, who did the watermelon smashing and all of that. But I mean, this was a production. And I mean, it used to take him an hour to set up everything before the show. And there's a line about Jay Leno came upon Lenny Schultz unloading in New York at one of the clubs, unloading all his barrels of props. And Jay Leno says to him, "Lenny, did you write all that?" But he used to end up in and Mitzi goes, "Is he naked again?" But he used to fall out, and that was his genius, and people loved it. I mean, it was,
sure.
But he would end up nearly naked on stage. That was what you called commitment to your act.
Right. Yeah. Work ethic.
Yeah, yeah, the work ethic. I do want to mention the LA Cabaret because you and I worked there. That was a club in Encino, California. I ended up doing probably 500 shows there because it's one of those alternative stages. When you weren't playing the Comedy Store or Improv or Ice House, you went to
Right.
the right.
Well, that's where we met. I mean, that's
Right.
where we hung out,
Right.
and I got to know you.
Yes, and Ray Bishop owned it for many years. The LA.
Correct.
My favorite story about Ray was for a while the LA Cabaret's slogan was a fun place for fun people. So Ray ordered all these matchbooks, with the slogan on it.
Right.
It was like 5 years supply of matches. He didn't proofread the artist copy that was sent to the printer, and it came back a fun place for some people. So if you did a joke that got booed, you say, well, this place isn't for you. It's only a fun
it's actually more accurate, when it comes to comedy.
Right. It ended up, I remember in cartoons in Salt Lake City, it was a club I headlined in 84 and 85. You mentioned liquor licenses. I don't know what Salt Lake's like now, but back then there were only 100 or 200 liquor licenses given out in the whole city of Salt Lake because of Mormon territory. And this club did not have a liquor license. So they would provide setups, and people, by local law, they brought liquor, which had to be in a unopened when they came in a brown bag. And, the club would have the setups or whatever. So if I ever had a joke that didn't go, my line in Salt Lake was, you don't understand. I just provide the setups. You have to bring your own. But those crowds, again, you'd figure Salt Lake, great crowds, because most people were what they called Jack Mormons. They weren't generally the Mormons weren't coming out to comedy clubs in the early 80s. It was the people in Salt Lake who were fun and fancy free. So again, the audiences were better than I thought. That's for sure.
I worked. They had private clubs there where they served liquor. You had to be a member. Right. I worked a room like that. I remember in Salt Lake, I think in the 90s. Anyway, what I'm reaching for here is I've been meaning to. Oh, what happened?
Yeah, it's all right.
Did it go dark?
No.
Oh, I can't see you. Oh, okay. Oh, I know what I did. I accidentally moved my mouse, and by that I mean
you thought
my mouse. Yeah.
Talk about the 80s.
Yeah. Ba-doom, boom. Anyway, so I want to plug your book, and I'm holding it upside down. I'm like Trump with the Bible.
Let me tell you, I would take 1,000,000 Leif Skidings holding up my book to one Trump holding it back. He would do more damage to my literary career than you can even imagine with one time. But I appreciate it.
But this book now it's not, well, I'll be honest with you. I have ADD, and I have trouble getting through. I'm halfway through. Okay. I've had this book for a couple of weeks. I'm halfway, but for me to get halfway through a book, it has to be really well written and interesting.
Because he was dyslexic and he doesn't read books, but he got through it. So
Yeah. Oh no. And I am getting through it, and I am enjoying it. And I'm telling you, I am so impressed with your writing skills.
Thank you.
This is top level. So I can't even talk, and you're writing this great book. It's so well written that I wouldn't think that it was done by a comedian. I would think it was done by a well-known author.
Well, thank you. And a lot of times writing is part of comedy, as you know.
Absolutely.
Write in a different form. I mean, writing jokes for the stage and writing, an act like you and I do. It's a different type of writing because you're writing a memoir.
That was actually what I was trying to get to. It's not necessarily about comedy or set up and a bunch of punchlines and a bunch of jokes. Although it is light reading, and it's about your childhood, and it's about baseball. It's about your family, and
I started being funny, which I'm going to ask you when you started to be funny in a minute, but I appreciate the plug. And it's, I don't know, they're hardcore baseball fans out there, but in 1964, when my family and I moved to the Philadelphia area, and I was 10 when I moved there, and the next year when I was 11, the Phillies we started following baseball as a family, and the Phillies were perennial losers. I mean, the kings of the National League were the Dodgers and the Cardinals and the Giants. But that year was magical in '64 because the Phillies took the lead in the National League early, well, in April, and then they never relinquished it. They were the dream team. Jim Bunning, the pitcher, pitched the first perfect game in the National League since 1880 on Father's Day. Our right fielder, Johnny Callison, won the National League, won the All-Star game for the National League with a 3-run homer in the bottom of the ninth. So it was the Phillies' year. And until the last 12 games, and the Phillies lost 10 in a row at the end of the year, they won the last 2. But that's why it's called slide. But they blew the pennant. It's still the greatest collapse in Major League history.
Right, and you managed to interweave that with your childhood and with your family.
It was the whole city, but for our family in general. But it was the origins of how I started using comedy to get through a bad time. Yeah.
Right. And there is so much there that I can relate to, because you and I are fairly close in age.
Very close in age. Oh, you're my junior, Leif.
Yeah, by a couple of years.
That's all right.
A couple of years.
I'd take it if I were you. You're my junior.
I'll take it. You'll take it.
When did you start being funny? Was it because people ask this of comics all the time, and I guess comics should ask each other. Were you funny in elementary school, high school? When was it?
I always loved comedy as a kid. I mean, Laurel and Hardy was like I remember the first joy that I experienced on television as a kid, as a very small child, and then growing up, stand-up comedy. As soon as I saw stand-up comedy, I mean, I fell in love with it. And I never thought I could do it. I thought you had to be a famous stand-up comedian to do stand-up comedy. Right. People just didn't just do it. You had to be on. Yeah. Anyway, so. But in answer to your question, I'm an immigrant. I came from Sweden when I was 11 years old, and I had a bit of a culture shock, and I kind of became an introvert. I was an extrovert in Sweden and became kind of introverted.
Yeah.
So I would take my moments. I would be very quiet and shy until I knew there was a real solid punchline. Right. And boom, I would hit it. And then I would retreat.
Right.
And then wait for the next opportunity. I wasn't the guy that was always funny.
Right.
So
that's a way to do it. And what you're describing is like a lot of comedy is just rearranging the elements of the world. It's taking hillbillies and putting them in Beverly Hills. Now you went from Sweden to the United States. So inherently you've got some dramatic conflict going on there. So I'm sure that entering your head was a way to look at the world a little bit differently, or be open to more creative and comedic ideas. So, it's always interesting to ask that of comics, because there is a childlike quality to comedy. We're really kind of reinterpreting the world for when people say, "Oh, that was my mother, that was my father. Oh, yeah, that happened to me on the freeway." Comics have reinterpreted the world for people who have maybe lost that creativity or childlike ability to see the world the way humans do.
Right.
I've always felt people like Robin Williams and people who are kind of childlike on stage and vulnerable enough tend to be the really, even someone like Chris Rock. I mean, Chris is mischievous. And he's got great material. I mean, I always said it's 50%, and theoretically it's 50% your material, 50% your style. Now there are comics who have great material, but not a lot of personality on stage. But there are other comics who have, if you've got both, if you've got great material and, Roseanne is the housewife, or Chris Rock with his preachy, a preacher mischievous style. If you've got both, you're going to make it.
Right.
Yeah, there's no question about it. So yeah, this has been fun. It's been a lot of fun. And by the way, that book is called Slide. It's on.
Yeah.
I really appreciate the plug. It's Slide, Carl Wolfson. And it's, you don't have to be a baseball fan to enjoy it, because it's really about, your family. And that's another thing. I was surrounded by crazy people in my family. My grandmother was so Republican, she refused to carry a Roosevelt dime until the day she died. I mean, that's stuff is comic gold.
Right.
And, the key in writing, I suppose, is write about what you know and tell the truth. So it's easy to write something where you lived it.
Yeah, and I've just gotten past the parts where you start performing and you got up on the table and did Ed Sullivan and did impressions, and you found, you know, gratification in getting that response from adults. And
Absolutely. And I had all these albums later on when I was in high school, David Fry and you know, Rich Little and all of
I
them.
got to work with David Fry at the
Did you
Improv.
really?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was one of my, because I started out doing, as a kid, I started doing impressions. I was
it's another
like
way
you.
kids get into comedy. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. And my first impression was John Wayne. Well, that's about the size of it. And I remember walking home from seventh grade, doing that, you know, walking 2 miles home from seventh grade. Well, that's about the size of it.
Did you ever see Denny Johnston do his John? You know Denny Johnston? Did you ever run?
He's one of the first headliners I worked with on the road. Denny's
classic bit. And you know, Denny never changes act.
Right.
You could Denny and you see him 12 years later and see the exact act.
Right.
And you be in the audience and watch that act and love it because it was so classic. But one of his classics was John Wayne as a stand-up comic. You know, he'd do a joke and then it would be a stupid joke and the audience would laugh and go, well, here's another little one for you if you'll like that, you know. So classic bits, but I forgot my train of thought. But yeah, impressions are absolutely one of the ways people get in. And I did them all like high school teachers and all that stuff. It's thinking is what you're doing.
Rich Little, David Fry, and Frank Gorshin.
What was he like? What was David like? David Fry, when you worked with him?
He was a bit of an introvert in my opinion. He would show up. He would show up just in time to go on, and then leave.
You know, David Fry's albums, which I still have, they were the most brilliant comic albums of the 70s. He did incredible political albums.
Yeah, he did. Yes, he did.
I remember you know, he did Richard Nixon smoking pot. You know,
my impression of Richard Nixon was my impression of him doing Richard Nixon.
Exactly. Now, I have to add to this that in 1985, when I was on a show called Thick of the Night with the Wolfson Report every week, and the stage manager on Thick of the Night, his dad, who was a TV director, knew Rich Little very well. And the stage manager, friend of mine, said, you know, Rich is always looking for new writers. So I wrote some scripts for his Vegas act, which Rich loved, some sketches. So I wrote for Rich for about 8 years. I was his head writer. I did an album for him and in an HBO special. Rich was also very introverted. I don't know if that has anything to do with impressionists or maybe comics in general. But Rich told me, Rich was very jealous of David Fry. And
really?
He was very jealous. And now what Rich said, and I'll never forget this, is that, you know, David Fry did the Nixon arms raised.
Right.
And according to Rich Little, David did that because David was short. And he said Nixon didn't do it that much, but David Fry did it all the time because he was short. But that was, you know, I think that's Rich Little's ego talking.
Right.
But my favorite Rich Little story, because he did a very good Nixon too. I think Fry's was better. But Rich told me that several years after Nixon resigned, Nixon had a Christmas party at San Clemente at the Western White House at his home. And Rich was invited. And Rich said he's at this party and it's like 120 people there in the great hall. And a bunch of people were gathered around Rich Little egging him on to do his Richard Nixon impression. So Rich finally gave in and he's doing his Nixon impression. He says, Nixon sidles up and comes in, he goes, who is he doing? So that's the measure of Richard Nixon, how awkward he was. And
that's a measure of every other club owner that thinks they know comedy.
That's right. That's a great way to end this because we started out with club owners, but there were so, you know, Bud Friedman loved to go on stage, but he was not funny at all.
Yeah.
And he loved his TV show and even the Improv because he got to go up and introduce all the acts. But
I remember when I became a regular, I worked my way up and became a regular at the LA Cabaret. And Ray Bishop, on nights when he would bring in people to showcase to see if, you know, if they're going to be regulars or not, he'd sidle up to me and go, "Is he funny?
Is he funny?
Bud's thing was, because I played the improv quite a bit before before 85, when when I didn't play it after they opened in San Diego, but he always had the door people seat two women in the front row. So Bud could go up at the beginning of the show and his joke was, "Oh, are you two women together? You must be lesbians." Oh, I mean, that was his big line.
Oh, that was his big, yeah.
So yeah, that's a great observation that Nixon, so unself-aware, was like club owners who thought they were funny.
Yeah. We could do a whole show on that.
Well, we've done it
on club owners.
Another one sometime in the future. That's great.
Yeah,
it's been fantastic. So
yeah, appreciate you doing this, Carl. It's been great to see you.
To see you, and I think we just scratched the surface of comics names and club owners names and club names and memories. So we got a lot more to tell.
Yeah. So Ed, if you're interested, leave a comment, please leave a comment, leave a question, and we'll get back to you. I read every comment because I usually only get 2 or 3. So
well, hopefully we can double that.
What's that?
Hopefully we can double that amount.
Yeah. That's the goal for this episode of Comedy Road, to double the comments from 3 to 6.
Well, I really enjoyed it. It was very heartening for me to think back on these times. I appreciate it, Leif.
I appreciate you doing it. Thank you, Carl. I've been looking forward to it. Take care, buddy.